One hot-button issue from the Democratic Party is the Green New Deal. It lacks specifics, but Democrats largely support it to move away from the reliance on fossil fuel. Now, this could be a defining campaign issue, with Republicans adamantly opposed to it, primarily as being too expensive. Back to my conversation with presidential candidate Pete Buttigieg. You're in favor of a Green New Deal. What proposals do you make that differ, let's say, from Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Senator Ed Markey, who've joined up on this?
The reality is that the Green New Deal in its current form, and as was written into those resolutions, is more of a set of goals than it is a
blueprint,
well-articulated plan.
The specifics are
I don't even know if we could call it a blueprint as more as an aspiration, but those are the right goals. And the reason that I speak favorably of the Green New Deal is it gets two things right. First of all, it correctly identifies climate change is a major emergency, something whose destructive power is comparable to a war or a depression. I believe we're already seeing evidence of that, and it's only going to accelerate, whether it's river cities like here or mine that have experienced consequences of extreme weather, or whether it's whole parts of California catching on fire. The second thing the Green New Deal gets right is that there is economic power and economic value in doing something about it. So in the same way that responding to World War II was part of what helped us end the Great Depression, I believe there's an opportunity to create jobs and create perhaps a more equitable economy through the way that we as a country come together and step up to get the job done. No, not all of the technologies have been fully developed. That's why we need a heavier investment in research and development. You know, if you took the Manhattan Project or the space program in the Apollo years and put that into today's dollars, it'd be something like $10 billion a year. And we're nowhere close to that in our funding of R&D to, for example, bring down the cost of solar. So that needs to be done, and there are other measures that, frankly, are no more obvious to us today than the rocket trajectories were known to President Kennedy at the beginning of the 1960s when he proposed the going to the moon with the Apollo program. But we know from the science and from the facts on the ground that we cannot afford to wait any longer.
Some of the other Democrats proposed some bold ideas. Fellow long shot Andrew Yang wants to implement a universal basic income, pay for that with a value-added tax. Elizabeth Warren proposes this tax on wealth. Bernie Sanders wants a tax on all computerized investment transactions to pay for public college for all. Are they off the mark, and where do you think revenue needs to come from to pay for a progressive agenda?
Look, you can't get something for nothing, and never mind paying for a progressive agenda. The reality is, to pay for what Americans expect right now, we're going to have to be more honest about revenue, because you can't just keep doing deficit spending even in the good times and expect that not to catch up to us. And by the way, it'll catch up to us on our watch. My generation will pay the bills.
Okay, so what are the honest solutions for revenue?
I think a wealth tax makes a lot of sense. It's not that different from a property tax, which is how we fund things like police and fire protection in cities like mine. I think a financial transaction tax also deserves to be looked at, partly because, frankly, a lot of these transactions, which make a handful of people preposterously wealthy, there's very little evidence that they contribute anything to the real economy. And so as much as we might need to revise income tax rates for the very wealthiest too, I'm less interested in taxing work and more interested in taxing wealth and taxing things like financial transactions whose real value to the real economy is questionable.
You get credit for bringing a reformation to South Bend with investment in advanced industry, a lot of that focus on data and technology. I guess, how do you apply that on a national scale, especially former industrial areas that lost big manufacturing in recent decades? Obviously South Bend, but the Quad Cities is among those areas.
Well, parts of the country like ours are being presented with a choice. To either pretend that we can turn back the clock, which I think is what the current president is offering, to imagine that we can somehow find greatness in the past, or to be a little more honest. I don't believe you can have an honest politics that revolves around the word again. And what that means is recognizing that the question isn't, will change happen or not? Can we stop all change or not? The question is, how do we make sure change works for us? Where I live, we've embraced advanced manufacturing. We found ways to put global investment relationships to work. For example, we had union auto worker jobs created producing Mercedes R-Class vehicles, German cars, that went to Chinese customers. So finding a way to make those global connections bring income and send
Can federal policy make that happen on a local level?
Absolutely. We can incentivize that with, for example, the right kind of taxation structure or R&D programs that incentivize a return to the so-called Rust Belt and flyover country, which, by the way, makes a lot of sense economically. You can buy a good house around here where I live for the cost of a parking space in Palo Alto. And I got to tell you that people are beginning to take notice of some of these inequities and appreciate the opportunity for a brain gain in our communities that right now are being told. And generations of people, including me, have grown up with this message that success somehow means getting out. You know, I found my greatest sense of purpose and my greatest success when I returned home. And a lot of people looked at me funny. You know, I had a Harvard degree, I was working in consulting, I was in big cities, and I realized that where I belonged was back home in the Midwest, and people thought I was nuts. But more and more, I'm finding a generation of people who are excited and committed about the idea of helping our communities move forward. They need city governments, but also a federal government that supports them in that aspiration, makes it easier, not harder, to be able to go home and make a difference.
You talked a little about your career getting to this point. You went to Harvard with Mark Zuckerberg at the time, I believe. Are you two friends, actually?
Yeah, I know him.
What do you propose, though, to protect the American people, let's say, from the abuses of big tech? Are we talking about laws like the European Union? Facebook hasn't been noticed being considered a good player as of late.
Well, look, we need policies that establish our ability to protect our data. I think right now it's very murky, and I do think tech companies take advantage of that. But I also think, you know, it's not up to the tech companies to figure this out. There needs to be a policy response that clarifies the rights and responsibilities, especially when it comes to the ownership of data.
Who owns it?
That we put in. Yeah, absolutely.
Who is it? The individual?
Well, we definitely need to clarify the ownership rights we have over our own data. And if somebody wants to...
But you're not willing to take a stance that it is the individual that owns their own data?
Well, if an individual wants to sell their data, that's where it gets murky, right? But I do think we need to start with that principle, that we have ownership rights over the data that we create and over personal data around us. And we should have our rights to visibility on who's accessing it, and especially rights concerning any time somebody's going to monetize it. You know, there are a lot of these internet companies where we think we're the user, but in many ways we're the product. And our legislative system is just light years behind. I mean, we see this embarrassing spectacle of senators and members of Congress trying to grill tech company executives when it's abundantly clear that they have no idea what they're even asking about. I do think that the European framework is one that we ought to look to. I'm not sure it'll be the exact same when we find an American version of that, but some sense that we need to protect individual data rights. We are long overdue for that. And frankly, I think if we get it right, the tech sector should appreciate that we've resolved that problem as a people so that they're not supposed to figure it out one by one.
You talked also, before your political days, you once worked for the prestigious consulting firm McKinsey and Company. You are quoted calling it the most intellectually informing experience you've had. Though it's been mired in 3 major scandals over the last year. You were only there, obviously, for, I think, 3 years and clearly not running the organization. But there are concerns that maybe there was an institutional failure there. How good is it for you to have that company and its recent history on your resume?
Well, when I was there, my specialty was renewable energy and grocery pricing. Those were the 2 things I learned the most about, and I never did something that I didn't feel comfortable doing. I think big consulting firms are going to have to ask whether they want to be viewed and treated differently from big law firms, where it's considered totally normal to work for clients in a sort of amoral way, or whether they need to be a little more picky about who they work with. It was pretty disturbing to see some of the client relationships that they took on, for example, in Saudi Arabia.
South Africa issues.
And they became part of something that I don't think is consistent with their values, certainly isn't consistent with my values.
Are you worried that could be, your competition could paint that?
That's for other people to talk about. Look, I can explain what my values are and what policies I'm for, and I'm hoping to be judged based on that.
You think you're qualified to reign in businesses that break the law?
What's that?
You think you're qualified to reign in businesses that break the law?
If you're not, you shouldn't be running for public office.
We couldn't fit my entire conversation with Democratic presidential candidate Pete Buttigieg here because of time constraints. How he responds to the challenge of being the first openly gay candidate ever to run. That's in a web extra online at ourquadcities.com. Now, our question of the week. What do you think about electing a mayor as president for the first time in U.S. history? Send your answer by email to fortherecord@whbf.com. or respond to this post on Facebook at the Local 4 News WHBF TV page or on my page.